The sun did not rise over the Iraqi desert. It simply began to exert pressure, a physical weight that turned the air into a shimmering, toxic fluid at 50 degrees Celsius. In the middle of this vast, indifferent expanse of sand and calcified rock, the M1078 Oshkosh cargo truck was not just a vehicle. It was an industrial monument to the American theory of war. It stood 18 tons of steel, rubber, and high-tensile engineering, a singular, rolling artery in the massive logistical system that defined the coalition's operational capability. To the elite special operations team crouched in the shadow of the chassis, that truck was supposed to be their guarantee of existence. The American doctrine of war does not ask the operator to survive in a hostile environment. It asks the operator to fight. And it tasks the logistics chain, the Oshkosh and its companions, to ensure that the soldier remains a combatant, never a survivalist. But as the wind began to howl, picking up the fine, crystalline sand and turning the horizon into a wall of solid grit, the truck ceased to be an artery and began to look like a tomb. The sandstorm wasn't just weather. It was a tactical event, an atmospheric weapon that stripped the modern battlefield of its digital transparency. The American team, caught deep in a zone where the enemy's presence was fluid and predatory, watched as the storm intensified, realizing with a cold, sharpening clarity that the arterial system they relied on was about to be severed. They had been trained to be the most lethal force on the planet, provided they had the water, the ammunition, and the medical supplies that the Oshkosh represented. Without them, they were no longer a tactical unit. They were 4 men in a pit, surrounded by an environment that consumed hydration faster than the body could replenish it.
The convoy, sent to rescue them, had been lured into a sequence of improvised explosive devices that turned the very roads the Americans relied on into kill zones. The heavy vehicles, designed for speed and protection, were now bogged down in the shifting dunes, their electronic systems choking on the microscopic abrasive sand. Inside their cramped hide site, the lead operator reached for his hydration bladder. He squeezed, feeling the flat, hollow resistance of empty plastic. It was a sensory shock, the feeling of a resource that had been guaranteed by a $1 trillion military infrastructure now simply vanishing into the heat. This wasn't a battle of tactics. It was a battle against the fundamental math of human survival. The American command system, built on the principle of overwhelming abundance, the requirement that every soldier be supported by tons of secondary logistics, had hit the hard wall of reality. They were not fighting the insurgency. They were fighting the depletion of their own system. Every hour the storm held, the American advantage diminished. The heavy armor that was meant to protect the supply lines had become an anchor, drawing fire and demanding a level of resource expenditure that the desert would not permit. The psychological shift in that moment was profound. The team was transitioning from being the most technologically supported soldiers in history to being creatures of the wasteland, forced to reconcile with the fact that their survival was no longer tied to their training or their weapon systems, but to the slow, agonizing depletion of their water supplies. They looked at the horizon, hoping for the rhythmic thrum of rotors, but the sky was nothing but a churning, opaque haze. The American machine, with all its aerial oversight, its satellite networks, and its logistical reach, was blind. It had been blinded by the sheer scale of its own requirements. To send a rescue, they needed a convoy. To send a convoy, they needed roads. To keep the roads open, they needed constant security. And to keep the security force alive, they needed more water, more fuel, and more logistics. The system was eating itself, cannibalizing its own resources just to maintain the static, vulnerable posture that kept the soldiers trapped in the middle of the desert. This was not a failure of courage. The men in the hide site were combat-proven, highly capable operators
who had survived the most dangerous theaters on the planet. They were victims of a doctrinal arrogance, the belief that the modern battlefield could always be engineered to accommodate the needs of the soldier. They had forgotten, or perhaps they had never been taught, that when the logistics chain is broken, the gear becomes dead weight, and the doctrine becomes a suicide note. They were watching their own system fail them in real time, observing as the massive, mechanized apparatus that was supposed to ensure their dominance proved to be the very thing that made them a target. As the sun began to dip, casting long, distorted shadows across the dunes, the American operators sat in the silence of the storm. They were observing the endgame of a philosophy that viewed the desert as a space to be overcome, rather than a reality to be respected. They understood that the enemy didn't need to defeat them in a firefight. The enemy only needed to wait for the Oshkosh to run dry. It was the ultimate cold realization of what it means to be part of an all-supported military force. You are only as powerful as your next supply delivery. And in the heart of the desert, the delivery is never guaranteed. If you are interested in the anatomy of modern conflict and how the reality of the ground forces the most advanced doctrines to break and reform, subscribe to the channel. We are exploring the hidden history of these logistical failures, not to criticize the men on the ground, who are always the ones to pay the price, but to understand why even the most advanced military machine in history can be brought to its knees by the simple, brutal geometry of supply. This story is not just about a botched extraction or a tactical error. It is about the structural fragility of systems that prioritize the efficiency of the supply chain over the autonomy of the soldier. We are about to strip away the myths of the all-supported military and look at the alternative, a philosophy of war that treats resources not as a given, but as a tactical problem to be solved with the least amount of signature possible. Stay with us as we dismantle the logic of the logistics train and see how a different doctrine, one built on the ancient, quiet, and brutal knowledge of the desert, could do what a division of armored trucks could not. The American logistical footprint is not a failure of planning. It is the inevitable tax paid for the doctrine of firepower overmatch. This system relies on the assumption of overwhelming, sustained engagement, where the capability to project force is directly proportional to the amount of material pushed to the forward edge of the battle. In the American military paradigm, the soldier is the most expensive and critical asset on the board. Therefore, protecting that soldier means surrounding him with a protective bubble of resources. Tons of ammunition, constant fuel replenishment, specialized dietary support, and the omnipresent reach of medical evacuation. This creates a logistical tail, a massive, grinding, multi-layered supply chain that trails behind every combat unit like a shadow. In the stable environments of Iraq's central corridors or the established forward operating bases of Afghanistan, this system is a marvel of human efficiency. It functions like electricity in a socket. The soldier consumes it without ever thinking about how it's generated, stored, or transmitted. It is a utility, a given, a fundamental baseline of existence. But in the deep, unpredictable reaches of the desert, where there is no infrastructure, this tail becomes a liability. The logic of the American command was simple. They believed that if they maintained a high enough tempo of supply, they could effectively buy their way through the environment. They viewed the desert as a space that could be conquered by the sheer, relentless volume of their logistical throughput. They were blind to the fact that they were telegraphing their intent with every liter of water they moved. In an asymmetric war against a mobile, decentralized insurgency, the enemy does not need to destroy the soldier to defeat the mission. They only need to sever the artery that keeps the soldier alive.
By relying on a system that required constant, massive replenishment, the American command had essentially given the insurgents a map of their operational necessity. The rebels didn't need to engage the highly trained, heavily armed Green Berets in a stand-up fight. They only needed to wait for the predictable routes of the water trucks,
the predictable timing of the fuel convoys, and the predictable reliance on the heavy logistics that defined the American approach. This was the structural vulnerability that the American command had failed to perceive. Their own strength had become their own map. The more they surged resources into the desert, the more they created a target-rich environment for a force that thrived on the destruction of lines of communication. The American system was optimized for a clash of titans, a war where both sides relied on similar, heavy logistics. When they applied this logic to a clash of ghosts, a war against a force that needed nothing, carried nothing, and left nothing behind, the system began to buckle. The Americans were fighting with a heavy, inflexible lance, while the enemy was fighting with 1,000 needles. The operational paralysis that set in during the storm was the result of a total system shock. The American command was not built to operate without its tail. They were trained to believe that the tail was an inseparable part of their tactical anatomy. When the desert conditions made it impossible to move the trucks, the American operators felt as though they had been stripped of their limbs. They were waiting for the utility to turn back on. They were waiting for the logistical flow to resume, assuming that once the path was clear, the supply chain would regenerate. They could not conceive of a mission that wasn't supported by that constant, life-sustaining pressure. The enemy understood this dependency far better than the Americans themselves. They understood that the American soldier was not an autonomous entity in the desert, but an extension of the supply chain. If you broke the supply chain, the soldier stopped moving. This was the brilliant, brutal asymmetry of the conflict. The American military had optimized for the efficiency of the delivery, but they had neglected the resilience of the consumer. They had raised a generation of elite fighters who were the best in the world at operating within the network, but who had never been forced to consider what happens when the network is not just disrupted, but irrelevant. The tail that provided the American forces with the comfort of their doctrine was the very thing that made them a hostage to the environment. They had created a logistical dependency that required a perfect world to function. But the desert, by its very nature, is a place where perfection is an illusion and stability is a fleeting accident. As the command staff continued to process the logistics of their failed supply lines, they were struggling to face the reality that they had optimized their forces for a war that could only happen in a sanitized, paved, and predictable world. They were learning, in the heat of the storm, that the most dangerous weight a soldier carries into battle is not his pack, but the belief that the system will always be there to carry the rest for him. The logistical tail had become the anchor, and the American command was finally beginning to understand that the heavier they were, the faster they would sink into the sand. Inside the command tent at the Coalition Forward Operating Base, the air was saturated with a sterile, recirculated chill of high-grade air conditioning. A sharp, artificial contrast to the oppressive, sand-scoured heat of the desert just outside the canvas walls. The Joint Operations Center was a temple of modern decision-making, a sprawling, dimly lit room filled with the blue light glow of high-resolution monitors, satellite uplink terminals, and the endless, frantic stream of data that defined the modern American way of war. The commander, a man whose career had been forged in the high-stakes, technology-dense theaters of the last decade, paced the floor. He was not looking at a desert. He was looking at a series of logistical puzzles that were currently and catastrophically coming apart. The symbols on his digital map were bleeding red. Every red icon represented a stalled, disabled, or isolated vehicle. Every gap in the lines represented a point where his logistical control had shattered under the pressure of the environment. His instinct, sharpened by years of success in environments where the US could dictate the terms of engagement through sheer, unadulterated mass, was to push harder. He was already drafting the orders for a hardened resupply corridor, a reinforced convoy escorted by a full company of Stryker infantry vehicles, supported by AH-64 Apache gunships, and managed by a rolling communications relay. To his mind, the failure was not a failure of concept, it was a failure of resources. If the desert was the problem, the solution was simply to bring enough force to dominate the desert, to treat the storm not as a force of nature, but as a tactical obstacle that could be cleared with enough horsepower and steel. Standing in the periphery, his hands clasped behind his back, was the British SAS liaison officer. He was a man who seemed entirely out of place in the center of the American tech juggernaut. He possessed the quiet, observational stillness of a hunter, his presence almost imperceptible amidst the frantic pace of the American staff. While the commander was obsessing over the volume of the rescue, the SAS captain was obsessing over the signature of the mission. He didn't see the failed convoys as a need for more armor. He saw them as a predictable outcome of an American system that was fundamentally allergic to the concept of low signature movement. When the British officer finally stepped forward, he didn't bring a proposal for more fire or more armor. He laid a worn, dust-covered topological map on the commander's digital table, covering a section of the grid that the Americans had largely ignored because it wasn't connected to the primary supply arteries. He didn't point to the highways or the paved roads. He pointed to the Bedouin lines, the ancient forgotten tracks that snaked through the deep desert, far away from the roads the insurgents were currently mining. He proposed an extraction mission utilizing 2 Land Rover WMIKs, weapons-mounted installation kits. Light, nimble, unarmored platforms that had been the backbone of British special operations for years. The American commander stared at the proposal as if it were a tactical suicide note. He looked at the map, then back at the SAS officer, his voice tight with frustration. "You're suggesting I send my men out in unarmored Land Rovers, in the middle of an active insurgent AO, without a secure comms relay? Captain, that isn't a supply run. That's a funeral procession. You are ignoring the most basic safety requirements of this theater. You are asking me to gamble the lives of my operators on the idea that they can simply drive around the war." The British captain didn't raise his voice to counter the commander's anger. He simply stood his ground, the quiet, immense weight of his regiment's history anchoring his response. He explained that the American logistical doctrine was not a safety mechanism. It was a beacon. By moving in heavy convoys, the Americans were not just delivering supplies, they were advertising their location, their intent, and their tactical limitations to every insurgent in the region. The rebels didn't need to be better soldiers than the Americans. They only needed to be better at predicting the American convoy's route. By refusing to adapt to the desert, the American command had essentially handed the enemy a permanent, real-time map of their supply lines. The SAS officer's argument was an exercise in tactical subtraction. He posited that the American military had become so obsessed with the tail, the massive logistical apparatus required to support their soldiers, that they had lost the ability to operate as hunters. They had traded their mobility for a sense of security, and the desert had cruelly exposed the fallacy of that trade. He argued that the Land Rovers were not weak because they lacked armor. They were strong because they were invisible, silent, and fast. They didn't need to dominate the environment with armor because they were capable of slipping through the cracks of the environment without being detected. It was a rejection of the firepower overmatch philosophy in favor of environmental adaptation. The room fell silent. The American staff officers, men who had spent their entire lives training for a war where the logistics were always assumed, were suddenly faced with a tactical reality where their assumptions were no longer just obsolete, they were lethal. The commander stood before the map, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the line that the British officer had traced through the dunes. He was a man who had been taught that command was the ability to bend the battlefield to his will. Now, he was being confronted with the terrifying truth that he was, in fact, being broken by the battlefield. He was being asked to stop fighting the desert and start working with it. It was an agonizing decision, To accept the SAS plan was to admit that his own military had built a system that could only function in a world where the enemy agreed to play by the rules of mass and logistics. It was an admission that his invincible armored convoys were the primary reason his men were trapped. The commander looked at the British officer, then at the map of the ancient trails, and finally he understood. He wasn't choosing a less effective method. He was choosing to stop being a target. He authorized the mission. But the look in his eyes wasn't one of confidence. It was the look of a man who was finally, painfully, realizing that he had spent his entire career under the delusion that he was the one in control. The command center began to shift. The massive screens that had been tracking the convoy's progress were turned off. The frantic coordination for air support was muted. The TOC began to pivot away from the strategy of more and toward the strategy of less. The American staff, usually so confident in the strength of their doctrine, were now watching as two light, stripped-down Land Rovers were prepared for departure. They were watching the departure of a patrol that was betting its survival on the oldest, most brutal, and most honest philosophy of war. If you want to cross the desert, you don't fight the sand, you become the wind. If you are interested in the evolution of special operations from the era of mass protection to the era of tactical psychological influence, subscribe to the channel, where we continue to deconstruct the myths of the battlefield and look at the moments where the old ways died. We are about to watch the two-man SAS patrol approach the heart of the desert, where there are no roads, no GPS-plotted convoys, and no safety net. Just a compass, a map of the ancient trails, and the silence of a patrol that knows how to disappear. Stay with us as we witness the paradox of the unarmored raid. The desert at night is a deception.
It offers a cold, crystalline stillness that belies the brutal, abrasive reality of the terrain. At midnight, two Land Rover WMIKs, the Pink Panthers of the modern era, peeled away from the perimeter of the coalition base. They were not the leviathans of the American logistical train. They were skeletal, stripped-down platforms, their frames visible, their profiles low enough to hide behind a moderate dune. They carried no heavy ceramic armor, no sophisticated jammers that would scream their location across the electromagnetic spectrum, and no armed escorts to draw the fire of every insurgent along the route. They were a whisper in a storm. The drivers operated with a discipline that was entirely alien to the armored convoy mentality. They utilized only the most passive night vision capability, preferring the natural, low-light adaptability of the human eye to the harsh, reflected glow of digital optics. They navigated not by the satellites that tethered the American military to its command, but by the ancient, scarred topography of the desert floor. They followed the Bedouin tracks, the faint, winding depressions in the sand that had been carved by centuries of migration and trade, routes that no military satellite had prioritized because they were too narrow, too soft, and too unimportant for the heavy machinery of a modern army. This was the SAS doctrine in its purest, most efficient form: the refusal to fight the environment. The desert was not an obstacle to be pulverized, it was a corridor to be exploited. While the American convoys were battling the physics of heavy vehicles in loose sand, constantly digging themselves out, constantly burning fuel, constantly exposing their flanks, the British were moving with the economy of a desert creature. They kept their momentum high and their signature low. They didn't stop for the storm, they adjusted their heading to avoid the worst of the drift. They didn't stop for the militia patrols. They identified the patrols from a distance and curved their route to ensure they were never within the line of sight. The American team, deep in their hide site, was experiencing a rapid, crushing psychological collapse. They were down to their last hours of water. Their radios were unresponsive, and they had long since stopped expecting a rescue.
They had internalized the failure of their own logistics chain. When the two WMIKs finally pulled into the depression of the height site, there was no dramatic roar of engines, no floodlights, and no call to arms. The vehicles simply materialized from the darkness, their engines cut, the silence of the desert returning almost instantly. The SAS operators stepped out, their movements measured, their presence calm. They didn't treat the situation as an extraction. They treated it as a resupply. They were not there to save the team. They were there to ensure the team had the means to survive until the storm passed. The exchange was brisk and professional. They offloaded the water, the medical supplies, and the spare batteries, their hands moving with a practiced, automatic efficiency. The American leader, disoriented by the sudden appearance of a rescue force that shouldn't have been able to exist, stood frozen. He watched the British sergeant check the perimeter, his rifle slung, his posture relaxed. It was a shattering juxtaposition. Here was a patrol that had traveled through the same kill zone that had crippled two American armored columns, yet they hadn't fired a single shot. They hadn't faced a single IED, not because they were lucky, but because they had never put themselves in the position to be targeted. They had traveled the invisible path, the path that the American obsession with hardened logistics had made them blind to. The departure was as abrupt as the arrival. The British had no intention of lingering.
They weren't there to provide a comfort zone. They were there to provide the supplies that would allow the Americans to hold their own position until the rescue helicopters could finally clear the weather. As the Land Rovers prepared to move back into the dark, the SAS sergeant looked at the American team leader and gave a short, sharp nod. There was no discussion of the route, no sharing of coordinates, and no tactical advice. He didn't offer to evacuate them because he knew that the American unit had its own orders. He simply left them with the reality of what he had done. He had mastered the logistics of the desert, not by overwhelming it, but by understanding it. The WMIKs pulled away, their tires barely marking the sand, and within seconds they were swallowed by the vast, yawning expanse of the dunes. The Americans were left with their water and their supplies, but they were also left with a new, terrifying clarity. They looked at the track marks left by the British vehicles, marks that were already being erased by the shifting sand. They realized that the unarmored patrol hadn't just saved them, it had exposed the profound vulnerability of their own system. The desert had not been conquered by force, it had been navigated by intellect. They were sitting in the silence of the storm, holding a plastic canister of water that felt heavier than the truck that had failed to deliver it, finally understanding that in the war of logistics, the most powerful machine is the one you don't have to carry. The dawn light hit the forward operating base with a harsh, unforgiving intensity, bleaching the color out of the sand and casting long, sharp shadows across the tarmac. The return of the American convoy was a display of mechanical failure. One of the massive Oshkosh water trucks was being towed, its chassis warped by the violent, uneven stress of the dunes, its tires shredded by the jagged volcanic rock that had shredded their logistical timeline. The recovery crews swarmed around it like mechanics working on a dying beast. In the center of the staging area, the American commander stood motionless, his eyes tracking the frantic high-decibel activity of his own logistical tail. He was watching the physical manifestation of his own doctrine, the immense, noisy, and vulnerable effort required to keep his unit operational in a theater that rejected such volume. A few meters away, the space where the British WMIKs had been parked was empty, clean, and undisturbed by the heavy, grinding treads of the American recovery vehicles. There were no oil stains, no torn-up sand, no debris. It was as if the SAS patrol had never been there at all. The commander looked from the mangled wreckage of his supply line to the vacant, silent ground where the British had operated with nothing but a map, a compass,
and a handful of canisters. The realization that settled over him was a quiet, crushing weight. He had spent his career believing that his primary duty was to shield his soldiers from the friction of war, to build a wall of logistics so high and so thick that the desert would simply cease to be a factor. He had been a man of volume. He had equated the capability to project force with the capability to sustain it through sheer industrial mass. He now understood that he hadn't just been sustaining his soldiers, he had been shackling them. He had created a tactical architecture that required a perfect, flat, and supportive world to function, and when the world turned against him, he had been left with nothing but the wreckage of his own expectations. The British SAS had operated on a fundamentally different definition of force. They didn't view the desert as a space that needed to be supplied. They viewed it as a medium to be inhabited. They hadn't won the mission through superior logistics. They had won because they had stripped away the dependency on logistics altogether. They had proved that the most sophisticated logistical chain is the one that exists within the soldier himself. The discipline to carry only what is needed, the intelligence to find what is missing, and the autonomy to act without waiting for the next supply drop. The commander walked over to the supply pallet, where a half-empty water canister from the SAS raid sat. He picked it up. It was light, utilitarian, and utterly unremarkable. It was a vessel for survival, not a symbol of status or institutional wealth. He realized then that for years, he had been fighting a war of luxury. A war where the American soldier was expected to be as comfortable and as supported as if he were on a training range in the continental United States. But war, in its most honest form, is not a comfort. It is a process of subtraction. It is the art of being effective while you are stripped of everything that isn't absolutely necessary. The lessons of the desert would resonate through the command long after the storm had cleared. They didn't stop using the Oshkosh trucks, and they didn't abandon their logistical superiority, but they began to teach a different curriculum. They started to emphasize the lean approach, the importance of being able to operate in the gray, disconnected spaces where the logistical tail couldn't reach. They started to value the operator who could disappear, who could move without a convoy, and who could survive on the water he carried, not the water he was promised. They had learned the hard lesson that the desert always eventually forces you to choose between your comfort and your life. As he walked toward the command tent, the commander left the empty canister on the tarmac. It was no longer a piece of gear, it was a reminder. It served as a permanent, silent marker of the moment the doctrine failed, and the soldier began to adapt. He finally understood that the most dangerous weight a unit carries is not the armor on its trucks or the crates in its hold. It is the weight of its own logistical dependencies. He had been a commander of a system that demanded the world yield to it, only to find that in the deep desert, it is the one who yields to the world who ultimately survives. The storm was over. The trucks were being towed, and the American command had begun the long, slow process of learning how to walk lighter, how to move quieter, and how to finally be the soldier that the desert required him to be. The tether was cut, the tail was gone, and for the first time, he was ready to operate in the void.